Brian, it's a pleasure. It's an honor. Thank you so much for joining me.
Good to see you. Good morning.
Yes, good afternoon.
Um, kind of. It's both. It's dark where we both are, so we
Yeah.
can't tell.
Brian, how have you been since your book released, The Immortality Key? It's incredible. I've listened to the audiobook version and the hard book version, and it's just blown my mind. How have you been since releasing it?
Busy and looking at screens like 13, 14 hours a day. And here I'm in Uruguay in South America. My wife was born and raised here. So, I mean, just after the book launched, actually, we came down here with our daughters, and I've been here ever since as a COVID refugee.
Yeah, and how has it been there actually?
Well, until very recently, it was paradise because it was summertime here, obviously, and the girls were going off to school and everybody was happy. But I mean, just in the past few days, the numbers are spiking out of control. A variant from Brazil has snuck over the border, so things are somewhat in disarray, unfortunately. How about you?
You know what? Thankfully, we've done pretty good here. Perth, Western Australia being so isolated. We
Right.
and that Western Australia did a hard lockdown, hard border closure, which created a bubble. You know, we've been in a bubble in which we've lived pretty normal lives. We just haven't been able to leave the bubble, which has been quite interesting. We travel a lot generally, but we've just been here for a year straight now, and it's been beautiful in the direct sense here and just crazy because we do spend a lot of our time generally in LA, in California, in Mexico, and Hawaii, and yeah, dear
Wow.
friends, you know, that have gone through such struggles and witnessing the world from this bubble. It's been trippy. It's been trippy for sure. At the same time, we've had the privilege to live pretty normal lives.
Wow, you lucked out. I know it's a tough time. This isn't small talk. It's the pandemic has thrust us into this awareness of death and just how quickly we can lose all this. I mean, this was unthinkable to me. I think of the 1918 pandemic as a distant memory. There aren't many people alive today who have robust memories of that, and here we are. It just
Mhm.
shows how fragile we are, how interconnected we are, how everything can just stop on a dime. And I think it's forced me at least to really kind of reassess, where we're going. I mean, as my family and collectively, it's just
Mhm.
it's a very existential thing.
Speaking of that, your opening quote in your book took my breath away, and I really loved how you opened up with, if you die before you die, you won't die when you die. I loved how you put that. So kind of cut straight to the chase, doesn't it? Of the psychedelic experience of what we're going through right now, like you said, this existential crisis, which I know in Australia, there's such a thick denial of death and our impermanence, yet in doing so, we don't really live. It really puts these opaque veils of distraction and illusion and illusion in which it seems that, I mean, of course, opening page, that's what you're shining the light on. What brought
Hmm.
that? For starters, what has your journey been to bring you to the inquiry into that?
Well, that begins a long time ago. I mean, maybe when I'm, well, I could talk about being 5 years old, but I mean, at least at 14, I'm ushered into this all boys preparatory school on the eastern coast of the United States, and I'm learning Latin and Greek from the Jesuits. And these same Jesuits, representatives of Rome in a way, representatives of the Christian Church, are teaching me all these things that do nothing but raise questions in my mind about the birth of Christianity and the origins of Western civilization. I mean, once you start to read the Greek, especially, I mean, on the one hand, you're finding really weird stories in Homer, right, about all these gods and goddesses marching around and these witches mixing potions and men turning to pigs and all these things you just kind of take for granted when you're reading classical literature, which is super weird. And then on the other hand, I'm reading the Gospels in their original language in Greek. And at some point, it just, it hits you that this was the same world, that the world that birthed, democracy and the arts and sciences and the theater and philosophy and literature. This same world of the ancient Greeks was also kind of involved in the birth of Christianity. The New Testament is written in Greek. And there's all these parallels between the ancient mystery cults, which we can talk about, and Christianity in its very early days, before it became the religion of Rome. And then I just struggled with those questions for years and years and years until I started finding out about psychedelics. And in 2007, I was reading about some of the early clinical trials on psilocybin, the active compound in magic mushrooms. And it just kind of hit me that, if people are having this transformative experience today from one and only dose of psilocybin under the right circumstances, maybe that was in fact what was happening 2,500 years ago or 20,000 years ago. I mean, who knows how far back this goes? And so it started in 2007, just kind of putting these very circumstantial pieces together. And it obsessed, for 12 years of my life.
Amazing. And I do find it so compelling and incredible that you haven't taken psychedelics yourself still to this day, or has that
To this
changed?
day, I'll
Wow.
take a lie detector test. Yeah, to this day, I stayed a virgin at first. I don't know, just because I wanted to approach the investigation very objectively, and you know, I'd read all these great books and all these great trip reports, and reading Aldous Huxley and Alan Watts. I mean, William James, over 100 years ago, and Terence McKenna. And I just thought I could never do justice to the experience the way they did. It's such beautiful, sublime literature out there. And so my goal was to do something a little bit different, and just to try and show like the hard scientific data that just might support a really crazy idea, which is that the ancients were in fact using psychedelics to find God.
Well, not to blow smoke up your ass, but you have done it justice. It's an incredible piece of work you've put out there, and I actually really bow to your strength, your restraint in not diving into, because it must have sparked curiosity of hearing again and again of these profound, life-changing experiences, and you able to stay strong on the mission, really.
Yeah, you don't know how many people have tried to get me to do drugs over the past 12
I
years
bet.
from all angles, including when I was traveling with Professor Ruck, who's now 85 years old. He's this classics professor in Boston, and largely responsible for this adventure of mine. He launches these crazy theories in the late 70s. But in any event, we're in Spain at one point a couple of years ago, and people are trying to sell an 85-year-old man drugs, for God's sake. And his response is, "Do you know who Albert Hoffman is?" And I'll call him a drug dealer. The guy said, "Yeah, I know Albert Hoffman. He discovered LSD." And Carl says, "Yeah, he was my friend." And the guy goes, "You must have done all the drugs in the world, mate." And Carl was basically like, "Yeah, we don't need an extra pad tonight."
Wow. Do you think you will, or are you gonna keep going?
I mean, how do I say this? I almost certainly will at some point. I'm kind of looking forward. I'm almost looking forward to a time when it's not newsworthy, when
Right.
when
Yeah.
it's legal, and I mean, we're so close on the
Yeah.
medicinal front in the U.S. at least, to FDA approval of psilocybin and other psychedelics. There's a decent argument under the First Amendment in the U.S. for the sincere religious exercise of these compounds. I just feel like over the next 5 years, everything's about to change. So that's probably my window. I'll
Yeah, that's
find
cool.
some ceremony somewhere that makes sense to my weird mix of pagan and Christian roots.
No, I really appreciate that. And on that same note, my wife's about to begin a intensive course of combining psychology and support for death with psilocybin, in
Wow.
which it's a weird paradox because it's so illegal here, yet the universities are bringing it into study for use in clinical, yeah, in a clinical format, which is exciting because up until very recently it was just illegal. There was no way
Right.
to get around it, but it's even changing here.
Wow, that's well. That was the case here. I mean, I credit whatever the psychedelic renaissance is becoming, and what happened in Oregon last November, decriminalizing drugs and regulating psilocybin for therapeutic purposes. I mean, I think it all begins, like at least in the modern iteration, at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. That's about 20 years ago now. Them starting that, and that eventually led to some great trials on palliative care, or rather with palliative care experts like cancer patients suffering from anxiety and depression at end of life. That's one of my favorite studies that came out. I think it was published in 2016. I mean, just incredible, incredible findings. And I think it was just taking the time and the patience to go through the clinical work, go through the FDA process, that it's finally beginning to dawn on people that these medicines are extraordinarily powerful. They don't work like other medicine. And for that reason, I think they take a lot of care and attention. So, I mean, kudos to your wife for studying up.
Yeah, I mean, psychedelics have been actually incredible for us as a family.
Oh yeah?
We truly feel we, like my wife and I, would not have met if it was not due to this particular psychedelic journey we were on with ayahuasca, in which we weren't together, and it was a peak experience in which it revealed to us just a clear, blissful vision that we were meant to be together and create a family. And we both had a vision of our daughter that was undeniable. And she was pregnant a month later. We weren't
No.
together. There was no rational, like, yeah, it's so indescribable and massive and blissful and clear and more real than than this, and we're so grateful for it. But what we
Wow.
like to bring to attention is that in we're not doing it every day, every month, not even every year. It's like a, a huge moment that we put a lot of prep into and a lot of research into and attention into and reverence. And then
Hmm.
it gifted us so much and still continues to 8 years later.
Wow, that's incredible, man. That's
Mhm.
I mean, you remind me of I mean, this is how it was approached in antiquity, right? And so I mean, my book writes a lot about the mysteries of Eleusis in ancient Greece, and there was a long period of preparation. I mean, I say at least 18 months. It could be longer. We don't really know the details, obviously. And you would make this long pilgrimage to Eleusis, northwest of Athens. You do it once and become like a first level initiate, and then you go back a second time, drink the magic potion, have a vision of the goddess, become immortal. Maybe find your soulmate. Maybe have a have a vision of your first child. I mean, it's just it's really profound stuff. The more thought that goes into it, um, the more extraordinary the outcome, I think, which says a lot about this, because again, it doesn't work like other medications. It seems to interact with the human psyche in ways that are somewhat unpredictable, and yet engineerable, right? This is why the volunteers in these clinical trials, I think, tend to have such positive experiences. They develop this trust with the clinicians. They're psychologically prepared for what's about to happen. It's in a safe and secure setting, and in some cases it's approached, I would say, almost sacramentally. And I use that word for a reason. I've been reading Richard Rohr a lot recently. He's a Franciscan friar and a beautiful writer, and he talks about sacraments as stun gun experiences. I mean, so to have a vision of your first child and to share that vision with your wife, I mean, as a father, that's a stun gun experience. It's something you will never forget. You can talk. I mean, you can mention this to your daughter when she's much older someday. I mean, it's a beautiful, beautiful memory you have there.
Yeah, yeah, it was incredible. And we've also witnessed, the room for growth with death, in which witnessing my wife's parents die in a
Wow.
setting in which essentially they were numbed out, not aware of what's going on. There was a denying of the situation, or not a clear communication of what's going on. And witnessing these deaths and also the predicaments in our culture has inspired this really conscious and potentially psychedelic platform for death, in
Yeah.
which we can really not push how one should die, but just provide a supportive platform to not be so scared about it. And it seems psilocybin in particular really shines a light on that it's all okay. Like it opens up that portal from physicality to death so um, so powerfully. So I do
Yeah.
find that exciting, these platforms for people to die consciously and to have access to this medicine that's not, hopefully, again, within a few years, not so stigmatized. And we
Mhm.
really can embrace it to help us embrace that powerful moment of death, which I know probably many listeners and people have brought it up with me, that they shudder at the even just the word death. Like it's so repulsive and cringeworthy, and they just don't want to even hear it. So it's
Mm.
understandable why one would just want to numb out on as much morphine as possible and not be aware of the situation. Yet to have something that opens up the vision, opens up the joy of the situation. I mean, I my main path is yoga, and in India, Varanasi is like the place that's like the holy grail. That's the place to be, because everyone is going there to die
Mm.
consciously, which
Mm.
at first just it blew my mind, not in a good way at first, like very repulsive, very scary. Yet it's making more and more sense, the power of that, those last
Wow.
moments, right?
Wow. I've actually been to Varanasi
Mm,
when I was a young man, after studying Sanskrit for 4 years.
right.
One of my best mates from college was from Delhi originally, and we did this backpacking trip through India and wound up at Varanasi at some point. I've never talked about this in public. No one's ever mentioned Varanasi, so I'll mention it.
Okay,
No, but it has very much
please.
to do with confronting death and how we avoid death. I remember going into the Ganges, and we were on a little boat, little rowboat, and I remember the bodies floating past me and being able to see the bodies, being able to reach out and touch them if I wanted to. And that memory sticks with me because I hadn't seen death before that. I'd had a couple friends, unfortunately, who died young, and I remember those funerals. But it was always a kind of a distance, And we were talking about like the pandemic when we started, as kind of our collective confrontation with death. We do not think about death. A friend of mine, Tony Bossis at NYU, one of the clinical researchers, says that we do not end well. And I think that that's a real problem, because death used to fit seamlessly into life. You see it right there. You can't miss it at Varanasi. And I think that it's an important part of the life cycle, is to be able to witness that death and dying process, to sit around. I mean, so I actually regret the fact that I haven't sat by people who are dying, and I would like to. Ram Dass writes a lot about that too. It's a
Yeah, I
wonderful
was just about to
meditation.
bring him up. Yeah.
Yeah, go for it, go for it. I mean, it's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, well, he's been very impactful. He's my primary teacher, actually, and we had the blessing of spending a lot of time with him on Maui. And I
Wow.
mean, yeah, and a huge chapter of his life was with the dying center, like a
Yeah.
legitimate center for people to go and die consciously. And I mean, at the time, it was completely cutting edge and was shaking up the terrain of the culture, really, because it is so taboo to have a place that's not fearing death. It is totally going against the grain, and
Yes.
he that became a major emphasis of his life. He would literally talk about being excited to be next to someone dying, because he felt it was the only moment of truth in that day. Like it's just pure truth, being with
Wow.
that person about to die. And it was beautiful to see how he brought that into his last days, into his last chapter, in which he didn't have much functionality post stroke. And it was
Right.
a real powerful teaching of how to navigate aging and the body uh, not working as well, and how to work with this aging, dying process, which even, I keep saying our culture, but it is true. Like, even that last chapter of when we are not as youthful and
Right.
functional, we kind of push it away, don't we? Yet he was a
Yeah.
shining example of how even that last chapter can be done consciously and beautifully.
Wow, what a great
Mm.
blessing for you. I'm so jealous. You got to hang out with Ram Dass. I listen to his lectures on death all the time.
Mm. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, we had he married us, and we then
Really?
like pretty much moved to Maui to be with him. It was an incredible time. Yeah. Yeah.
That's good. I never knew that. That's
Hmm.
fantastic.
Yeah, it was a wonderful time, and even that
Wow.
still is kind of a aftermath of that psychedelic experience as well, of really diving into Ram Dass's work and how he pushed the exploration with psychedelics to the edge, and
Right.
then integrated that into not needing psychedelics and finding access into spirit and into the heart without psychedelics. It got me curious about that as well, hearing him talk so candidly of taking psychedelics to the edge, and then taking the exploration of death to the edge, and such a pioneer.
Wow, he's a very special person. I love the story he tells about his guru in India, and
Mhm.
offering him the LSD, and and I think the quote is something like, it was believed that a drug like that could get you into the room with Christ, but it couldn't keep you there.
Right.
I always like that idea. But the more and more I think about it, and I was talking with another friend about exactly that, that story last week. I've come to see, as a virgin, I've come to see psychedelics amongst the other spiritual tools in the toolkit as kind of like Google Maps. And so, it might not keep you in the room with Christ, but it's not going to help you if you don't know where that room is in the first place. And so, how about, this is how I think of it. I mean, just, a taste of paradise, where Thomas Merton says something like, where you can realize that the gate of heaven is everywhere. And so I think that, Ram Dass certainly arrived at that conclusion at some point, but he'd been there, right? I mean, you'd have that direct experience of whether it's the beyond or the divine or some combination thereof. I mean, this is what the great mystery schools were always teaching. It was a profound, sometimes once in a lifetime experience of the divine and this beatific vision that I think is then only the beginning of a life dedicated to, I wouldn't even say religion or spirituality. I would say, in deference to Ram Dass, in service, in Dharma. I would say a life dedicated to service. And I think that that's the great insight of these extraordinary experiences.
Yeah, that's so true. It shines such clarity, such directionality, in which our thinking mind can tend to get so clouded with how we've been brought up, how our parents told us to be, and it really can cut through all those samskaras of the conditioned mind, and shine a deeper truth, no doubt. Which, again, I keep blowing smoke up your ass. I don't mean to, but it's so cool how obviously you've got a depth of it feels like contentment and directionality and purpose, in which you haven't needed anything like that to shine the light on.
Hmm.
Would you Do you kind of give thanks to anything in particular that has helped you with that? Is it your faith in Christianity, which you do identify with, right? Or was it
Yes.
how you were brought up? What do you think?
Well, I feel like I'm in therapy, but I'll answer. I mean, I'll answer. It's tough. It's tough for me to expose myself. I'll
Right.
expose myself, man.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, no, to be totally honest, and no one's ever asked me this, but like, I do feel like I was born with some kind of crazy balance of neurochemistry. I mean, I don't know why. I don't typically fall into depression. I don't have a lot of anxiety, and I can't credit that with anything than maybe just luck or genetics. But you know, when I was younger, you suffer through traumas like anybody else. And I mentioned the Jesuits, and for me, you know, is my life kind of reads like a storybook. You know, the Jesuits were, you know, helping me with my mind and my intellect, but they were really feeding the heart. And so I'd been in Catholic school since I was a little boy, but like, you know, learning from the Jesuits, being taken care of by them, um, was a beautiful experience for me at a time when I needed direction in life. I was in a dark place in my early teens. And they were there not to foist any doctrine or you know, or dogma onto me whatsoever. There was just this loving presence. I mean, if any, just helping me get into college, really. And they did. I wouldn't have gone to college if it weren't for the Jesuits and my Greek teacher, who put me on a train up to the northeast part of the country to visit schools. You know, so I mean, I owe them everything. I went to college on a scholarship, the first person in my family, and it was just, you know, kind of working through all that childhood stuff and discovering these principles and discovering contemplative mysticism, that I found some kind of homeostasis. And then when I was in college, I got into Sanskrit and I was meditating all the time. And then, you know, investigating all these esoteric traditions, Kabbalism and Sufism and all kinds of Western esoteric traditions. And it kind of just, it stuck with me as the thing that got me through the trauma, right? In addition to psychotherapy and traditional stuff. I mean, it was just finding practices like this just kept me straight. And at some point, I don't know when it was, my late teens or into my 20s, I found peace, and I found, you know, a sense of belonging. And then when I was 27, then I realized what was going on. They say there's two important days in your life: the day you're born and the day you figure out why you were born. And I don't know, but aside from the birth of my daughters, obviously, and meeting my wife, I mean, when I discovered these little clues about psychedelics, there was something there for me. I mean, it pulled at me. And I mean, I hope that answers your question. I mean, it
Oh, for
felt like
sure.
it gives my life purpose and direction.
Mhm.
And like obsessing over this book, for example, has resulted in all these other beautiful things and great relationships and opportunities to travel and investigate. And, you know, I feel completely blessed by the entire experience.
Amazing. And how old are you now? I'm like
Uh,
picking your mind apart.
yeah, please. I love it. I'm 40.
Yeah, cool. Because that even that period, 27 you mentioned, that it's such a powerful period. And I've been
Yeah.
speaking with guys that are bringing in like rite of passage into schools, which is really exciting. Because
Yeah.
that period of being a teen in high school. I mean, for me, I resorted to drugs as a young teen, as like, I think in retrospect, to unconsciously I created these like rites of passage and experiences that
Sure.
showed me who I truly am, because I also was going through dark times, and I then resorted to just, yeah, just raving and grunging and taking a lot of drugs, you know. And I'm
Yeah.
actually lucky I survived it. I nearly didn't. And it then helped
Wow.
me to have clarity on who I am. But then that next kind of that phase, often called Saturn return. Have you heard that term for
Yes,
like 20? Yeah.
it's a 27, 28, right?
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
27 to like, 31, sometimes 32, where people either like take the easier route, the most familiar kind of conditioned pattern, or they break through into their true purpose and really go for it. Or a lot of people actually, that's when they commit suicide, of just like
Wow.
total identity crisis and confusion and darkness. It's
Hmm.
quite an interesting time in which it seems, again, looking at these like rites of passage
Mm-hmm.
programs that are getting put into schools, um, possibly supportive platforms of awareness during that tricky time of 27 into 30s. And then, like, of course, midlife crisis stuff and death stuff, like, and what we're seeing of like PTSD, of how like people can really, I mean, the amount of times I see people get put on medication, which is all
Right.
well and good, but with no game plan. and no real like intelligent support. And sometimes it is, but the amount of times I've seen people put on this pill and that pill and another pill and just be in a
Right.
cloud of numbing, in which
Right.
could be good temporarily, but it seems like these emerging old medicines do the opposite. And rather than like clouding, they open us up to
Mm.
this clarity and directionality, which again, super exciting to see what you've revealed and what's to come. Have you had like, with your book, have you had much pushback from religion, from mainstream? Have you had much
Right.
pushback?
Um, Surprisingly little. Now
Good,
maybe that's just because it's not on the radar, but it's no, it's the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive.
good.
Knock wood. And I like to see the critiques though, because I like to see where this conversation should be heading. I like to see what mistakes I'm making, and I always like to to circle back and hear other people's perspectives. But in general, it's been really great, including with priests, pastors, ministers, rabbis.
Right.
Every couple of weeks, I'm doing a Bible study on Clubhouse, and maybe we'll find another venue soon with a rabbi in California, Rabbi
Wow.
Zach. And I just have the most fun time going through the language in the Hebrew and the Greek, and really geeking out on all the things that, again, I mean, in response to your question, the things that made me feel like I was alive, and the things that made me feel like I belonged in this world, which was ancient languages. And I can't explain why that was the case. It's not mathematics. I suck at math. It's definitely not math. But when it comes to languages and antiquity and these historical mysteries, I mean, that was alive in me as a teenager. And I love learning about this. And fortunately, the reception has been just wonderful, including in the religious establishment, and within academia at different universities. Had some really great chats and future projects that we're working on. So it's been great.
That's so cool. Because I mainly ask that because I have come across a couple of dear friends slash students that are devout Christians, and they, when I've brought it up into conversation, not pushing it onto them, none of that, just into conversation, like, what do you think? Um, they want no part of the conversation. Like, it's just a wall goes up of, come on, you're promoting health. Why would you even talk about psychedelics? Why would you even
Hmm.
contemplate taking drugs? You're all about health, and total denial that it had anything to do with the origins of these religions.
I
Total
hear you.
denial, just not wanting to hear it, not wanting to play any part of the conversation at all.
I mean, that was certainly I mean, that's still the case, obviously. I mean,
Mm,
I talk to people like that too.
mm.
But I mean, it was more the case back in the 70s when a lot of these theories were circulating. I mean, I think Carl Ruck, for example, probably got the shorter end of the stick than I did. I mean, I just got lucky to be born into a time when there was all this clinical research and hard science attacking this issue, from all kinds of different disciplines, in the psychopharmacology and neuroscience, and I think I've benefited from that, and I haven't found a lot of taboo. It's certainly baked into society and cultural biases that we have from the war on drugs. But I mean, that war is kind of coming to a halt, as it should, because it's ridiculous. And nobody was ever cured of their drug addiction by going to jail. So it never should have entered the criminal justice system in the first place. But I mean, in any event, at least in the States, I feel it. I feel it slowing down, which is a very positive thing. And then again, like when I have one-on-one conversations like this, I just try and be sensitive to where people are coming from. And I talk to, a professor at Harvard, or if I'm talking to a Catholic priest, or I'm talking to a Greek Orthodox priest, I try and meet them where they are. Or like the excavator at Eleusis, for example, which I write about in the book. She's not a fan of psychedelics. And so, rather than just like berating her, I mean, I hear her out. She makes wonderful points. I mean, do psychedelics have to be the answer to this best kept secret in history? No, but they could be part of the answer. It could be part of the reason behind the birth and development of Christianity. It doesn't mean there were psychedelics at the Last Supper. I think it's, if you take a more nuanced approach to the whole thing, for me, it's just about going back into the record and seeing, what we can prove, what we can't, and what this means for today. If, and it's a giant if, but if psychedelics were involved in a meaningful ritual way to the birth of Western civilization, what does that mean for us now? And I mean, just like you're saying, I think what it means for me is when I look back, I see ritual, I see ceremony, I see great myth, I see people taking it seriously. And so fortunately, there are people like you out there. And I think that you're a great model for how these very powerful compounds ought to be approached. And I think you learn that by looking through history.
And it is interesting. It's just so beautiful how that one experience, it naturally makes you a more moral and, like, to get to the core of religion, a more religious person, not in a particular dogmatic way or anything like that. It just that mystical experience, that direct, undeniable connection, naturally makes you more religious, more moral, more loving, more kind. So it's so interesting how it does tend to, from that vantage point, get lumped into the same category as hard drugs and whatnot. Yet it's just completely different. It's completely different.
And we're realizing that. Yeah. I mean, so Bill Richards, you remind me of something he writes in his book. So Bill Richards is one of the researchers at Hopkins, and he wrote a great book, Sacred Knowledge. And I think he throws a perhaps in front of this statement, but he says something like perhaps things like ethics and morality are genetically hardwired into who we are, and psychedelics seem to elicit that. Because in these volunteers, again, whether it's months or years after the fact, they report becoming better versions of themselves, right? Not just like self-satisfyingly more content, but more engaged members of the species. Like I start the book with a woman named Dinah Baser, an atheist, so it has nothing to do with religion, but she talks about her experience as being bathed in God's love, which is an interesting turn of phrase. And then she also was telling me that these great stories about falling in love with her family, and she was an ice skating instructor. And when she went back to class after her experience, it was very different for her. She would see the goodness in people. I'll never forget when she told me that. And she could see like the genuine nature of people, and that's often reported, that it elicits all these pro-social qualities like kindness and self-sacrifice and all the stuff that we could use today. I mean, it's just it's one way there under the when it's done properly, but it's a really powerful testament. Yeah, maybe this is where ethics and morality come from.
You have touched upon on Soma briefly, and I know you've gone deep into Sanskrit and the studies of yoga in a way. Like Sanskrit, you take it deep enough, it gets very mystical, doesn't it?
Sure.
The perfected language. And what is your understanding of Soma? Because in the yoga scene, there's a lot of assumptions and a lot of conversation around it, that it is just a magic mushroom, but it's not clear, is it? It's a little murky.
It's very murky. I would say, I studied Latin and Greek, which are not easy languages. And I often compare, Sanskrit is like both of them combined, plus a carnival ride through the most difficult discipline you could ever imagine trying to learn. I think that's why it takes several lifetimes reincarnating to learn Sanskrit properly, by the way. I got nowhere close to mastering it in 4 years.
Wow.
So what I do know from the Vedas, though, is, it's described in very powerful terms. And Gordon Wasson, in his book, so the Divine Mushroom of Immortality, Soma, back in the 60s, he makes a compelling argument for the Amanita, and found some support for that. And then there's a really interesting paper, I think I referenced in the book, by Calvert Watkins, weirdly published in the same year as this other book about the ancient Greeks, The Road to Eleusis. But Calvert Watkins writes a brilliant paper, Let Us Now Praise Famous Grains. For some reason, I always remember that title. But he talks about Watson's research a little bit, but does a lot of cross-linguistic comparisons between all these Indo-European languages, and essentially comes to the conclusion that soma is magical. So he actually, it's weird. He does favor the Amanita hypothesis for some reason, but I think where I fall is that it was something magical. It seems like something entheogenic, just in the way it's described in the Sanskrit. And when you compare the Sanskrit of the Vedas to like the Avestan of the Heoma tradition, or even the Greek, and Calvert Watkins looks at Homer's Greek, and he does all these beautiful analyses and exegeses of the text, and you just walk away thinking, and there's something interesting happening here. And I've gotten in trouble for that in different circles in India for suggesting that. I mean, this is, it's very sacred territory. So I don't want to speak out of turn. I would say clearly, and I think anyone would agree, there's something very magical with soma. It's clearly a thing, like a real thing. So it's a sacrament. It's not just something the priests were envisioning, and it is consumed and does result in this communion with the divine. So I'd love to go to India again, actually, and do some more investigation.
And I've also heard great teacher Richard Freeman talk about soma from the Greek. Is there a similar word or the same word, soma, in Greek?
Yes.
In which, so he was talking about it in the context of yoga, and how the Greeks talked about soma in that it's the body, and he would, similar to what we were talking about before, if you can take the external source to be with Christ, to be with Christ consciousness, or you can find it in the body. And apparently that is partially how and why yoga asana and breathing techniques got developed, to kind of squeeze our inner soma and bring consciousness and breath and attention into the pineal gland and unlock a deep, innate, mystical experience that we can actually create just from tending to the body and the mind. Have you heard of anything like that?
I mean, yeah, I don't doubt it. I think it's worthy of investigation. I mean, I know Rick Strassman writes a lot about endogenous DMT, not only in mystical states, but potentially in near-death states or at the end of life itself, and even in alien abduction, which is his book is phenomenal.
Which book?
DMT, the spirit molecule.
Right. Yes, it's great.
It's an incredible book. I mean, it needs more investigation, but I mean, I don't doubt it. We're walking bags of chemicals. I mean, I was talking to Dennis McKenna, Terrence's brother, 2 weeks ago, and he's the first one to say that every experience you have is a drug experience. It's just different perturbations of serotonin and dopamine, and oxytocin and everything else. I mean, every experience you've ever had, falling in love, is a drug experience, and so. I mean, given what I know about Sanskrit and given what I know about the tradition there, and the yogic tradition, I don't doubt for a second that these mystical states are achievable, without the use of a sacrament, whatever kind of sacrament that is. And for the rest of us who aren't as disciplined, or who are spiritual idiots, sacraments have always existed. And I mean, in Catholicism, we have the whole concept of sacramental theology. We do use incense, and we do have the Eucharist and the wine and the bread and the water at baptism, and so I think it's fine to look to the natural world for allies along that sacramental path. But clearly, I mean, as Ram Dass knows better than anybody, at some point, the more enlightened you become, I suppose, the more self-enlightenedly sufficient you become.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of Terence McKenna, I feel compelled to bring up the stoned ape theory. So do you feel we've been seeking these psychedelics for even prior to civilization, prior to humanity, like thousands of years ago, potentially, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt that pharmacology is old. I'm talking with a paleoanthropologist friend of mine in South Africa about this. like when you look to the human species, you're always looking for universals. There aren't that many universals. You think about something like language. You know, all human societies have had language since time immemorial. This concept of a spirit or the recognition of self-mortality. I mean, burying our dead is kind of unique to humans, and universal. And then there's pharmacology. It's we don't find too many troops of humans going into deep prehistory that didn't have some kind of relationship with the natural world. And so when you see universals like that, my friend in South Africa says, well, you could be dealing with a legacy. You could be dealing with something that predates our species. And we know that primates avail themselves of medicinal roots and even fungi, both in chimpanzees and gorillas. I quote one study in my book about Neanderthals using different medicinal drugs 50,000 years ago. We can actually find it in their teeth in the dental calculus. I mean, so clearly this story is tens of thousands of years old, if not hundreds, if not millions. And so, I mean, something like the stoned ape is something I actually want to test.
Yeah. And I'm going back and forth, but back to Sanskrit, which again, I find it so just incredible that you've studied both Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit and taken it really deep. But I remember a dear friend of mine who's also studied Sanskrit would talk about the precision of rolling the tongue, like with particular pronunciations, this repetitive, like specific rolling of the tongue across the upper palate partially is designed to stimulate the pineal gland and to bring prana up and down the sushumna nadi, up and down the central axis. So it's an expression, but it's also a vibration through pronouncing these words that you are like creating this ripple through the upper palate, up and down the central axis. Essentially, it is a yoga practice, just the verbalizing of these Sanskrit words. Do you agree with that? Do you feel that?
I don't disagree too much. No, I mean
Yeah.
it's a workout. I mean, pronouncing
Right.
Sanskrit is a workout, and there are consonants that don't exist in English, which is complicated to say the least. But I mean, even something like Om. We say Om. It's really Aum. It's really like a very complicated. And Joe Campbell talks about this too. So I'm not saying anything original here. But to pronounce the Om well is kind of it's a breathing exercise. It begins with the ah in the throat. The breath moves through the mouth, and as it does that, every single vowel is supposed to be pronounced along the way. So as you're controlling the mouth, so the aum and the m closes it, and then there's a silence, which is the in breath again. And so it's actually this circuit that you're creating with the om sound if it's done properly. And when you hear monks chanting it by the dozens, you get the sense that you've tapped into a very deep mystery there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, beautiful. Back to your book. Now, you're riding the wave of it for sure. And I'd be excited to know what's to come. What are you feeling over the next year, 2 years, 5 years of this book? Is there another book to come, a documentary? Like, how are you going to further just fuel this incredible body of work?
Thanks, man. You're very kind. I'm definitely I love to write, so I'm gonna keep writing, and there's definitely a second book, which will be easier when we can travel freely in a post-COVID world. But I mean, there's more. There's just a lot more work to be done. I presented the Immortality Key, which is really just I mean, it's a couple of studies, really. I mean, we won't get into the details, but when you're looking for hard scientific data, I mean, it was essentially the ergotized beer that I turned up in Spain and this kind of witchy cannabis opium wine from Pompeii. And these were from 20 years ago. And so, I presented those two finds just for the proposition that maybe there was more drugs in antiquity than we've been told. And so I think that the job now over the next couple of years is just going out into the field, doing more testing with all this modern instrumentation, which, I mean, all it really needed was just kind of attention and funding. There aren't that many people who study ancient pharmacology, but my friend Andrew Ko at MIT, whom I profile in the book, is one of them. And he's very intrigued. by going out and this is his job is, you know, is testing this stuff. And so I think that that'll be an interesting part of it. And there may be a docuseries at some point that puts this all on the screen. I did a great video with After School, which is a lot of fun for me, actually. A way to like visualize this stuff. You can find it on YouTube, the best kept secret in history. So I mean, so I like kind of creating different media for people to engage with this who don't want to sit down with a book necessarily.
Totally see a Netflix series on it. Have you checked out, it's not on Netflix, but on Vice, Hamilton Morris's series?
Oh, I love Hamilton. I was texting with him a couple weeks ago. Yeah,
It's a great
he's
series.
a genius. He's a genius, man.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I can see something quite similar to that with your work, huh?
If I knew chemistry like he did, it'd be an interesting show.
Oh,
He's a character. He's fantastic.
such a character. And what do you see with religions, and what do you see with this emerging information and work for the future? Like we're seeing it done in clinical settings. Do you see like retreat centers, or how do you see this really coming into everyday life for people?
No, that's a good question, and that is something that I mean that's kind of a passion of mine. Is figuring out. I mean, outside the medicinal context. I mean, there are people who are suffering, and there are people who will clearly benefit from something like psilocybin, whether they're suffering with anxiety or depression or end of life distress or addiction, PTSD. There's so many people suffering, and there's a need for those retreat centers, and maybe Oregon, for example, will be just kind of a first step in a larger program that you see across the states at least, and probably elsewhere eventually. But then, you know, on the other side of that, you have this religious sensibility that is awakened in people under these experiences, and I think there's a place for that too. Um, you know, in the Native American church, it's already happening, obviously, with peyote, or like the Santo Daime, it's already happening with ayahuasca. But I mean, I sense, you know, a moment where these experiences for those from like a Judeo-Christian background, for example, or no background whatsoever, people who are spiritual but not religious or have no faith in particular, might be able to avail themselves of some kind of ritual that is not necessarily medicinal, not necessarily recreational, but you know, somewhere kind of in that space where I think a lot of people are actually people who are, you know, whether they're suffering from existential crises or are interested in these big ontological questions. These are phenomenal tools for self-exploration. And I know I say that as a virgin, it sounds weird, but I mean, from what I've read and from what, you know, the folks I've talked to, um, in the right circumstances, these can be powerful, meaningful experiences. I mean, if this is what was happening in antiquity at a place like Eleusis, for example, I mean, I can only imagine the effect that would have today. And so, you know, part of my interest is figuring out what that, you know, ritual would look like in a way that actually means something to people. You know, if you're Christian or Jewish, there's one path there. If you have no faith whatsoever, there's one path there. I know that synthesis, for example, in the Netherlands, I've had a great chat with Dan Kaiman. It seems like they're doing very safe work there that at the same time is sacred and is approached with reverence. And there's all kinds of great models, I think, that are going to be emerging.
Yeah, super exciting. Brian, this has been amazing. I feel like I can just chat with you for hours, but I appreciate your time, and your wife would probably appreciate your time and energy with the kids. So thank you for your time, and so good to connect. And you're a genius. It's amazing what you've put all this time into, 12 years into this book, and I really wish you blessings on the continuum of it getting out there and really, yeah, it's so well done.
Oh, thank you, man. Well,
Hmm.
we got to hang out in Maui sometime or LA. How
Yes, we
about that?
do, for sure.
Let's make it happen in a let's say a prayer for a post-COVID world when we can
Yes.
have human interaction again.
Mm.
I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, all the best with everything. Is there anything you want to let our listeners know about? I'll leave links below, of course, to your book and the audio book and everything. Anything else?
it's all there. I'm a big fan of the audiobook.
It's great. And it's good that you're speaking as well. Great to hear your
That's
voice.
why.
You've got a great voice, and it's so good. I
had a
actually
lot
put
of
it
fun.
on. I feel like I've been with you for like 12 hours straight, because I went to bed last night listening to it. So good. It's a very soothing voice, as well as so enlightening and educating. So it's
And
great.
I have friends of mine who make fun of my reading voice, which is obviously a bit more formal than like normal conversation. And so they'll ask me to do my reading voice to them, which is a lot of fun for me now. That's my party trick.
That's great. All right. Well, much love, Brian. All the best. Take care.
Thanks, man. Great to meet you.
Bye. You too.